Good evening. So it's 6 o'clock. We're going to get started. We've got 2 people in the classroom tonight and about 5 or 6 signed up. So we're going to continue tonight with a discussion of the firm. And as always, I'm going to pause periodically to check the message board to see if there are any technical difficulties or if anybody's got any questions. And then, of course, the 2 of you who are in class can just raise your hand and let me know if you have a question. That's the pretty easy part. So again, this is going to be taking a lot of rather complex material you probably saw in the textbook, and my goal tonight is to distill it down into what you really need to know and distill it down into managerial applications again. So again, we have this question of where does supply come from? Well, we saw last week, and I'm going to zip through some of the slides from last week as a refresher. These are posted on Canvas, and I'll be posting later tonight or sometime tomorrow a slightly updated version. I didn't like some of the graphs, and I didn't like a few of the things, and I think I caught a typo or 2, but nothing major. So these are changes at the margin. So we talked about, here's our overview again. We talked about why supply in the firm, and really there are 2 parts to understanding supply. The first one is the internal one. What can you produce? What are your capabilities? How can you take capital and labor, mix them up and make stuff? What are your production costs? And that's one component. But the second component is what kind of market are you acting in? So it's again a little bit back to this principle of constrained utility. Remember our utility curves? You have your preference, and your preference is fine and wonderful. I would like to have the opportunity to choose between 3 private jets and 2 Ferraris. That's nice. I don't have that option because my budget constraint is going to limit me. Well, in general, I'm a professor, right? So I'm perfectly happy with my life, but I can't afford Ferraris and private jets. So my preferences are one thing, but I also need to know what the constraints are for my environment. We saw that also with the firm. You have to know what kind of an environment you're operating in, and we're going to see tonight that there are 2 fundamental different kinds of firms. One is called a price taker, and the other one is called a price searcher. Now, why does this matter for us? If you're a manager, you're going to want to know if you are a price taker or if you're a price searcher, and that's going to affect your choices because, good evening, the price taker, as this name implies, has to take the market price, has no choice, cannot engage in pricing strategy. The price is set by the market. Good evening. On the other hand, the price searcher can set the price, which means that the price searcher is going to have to make some strategic pricing decisions to try to figure out what the optimal price is. So we're going to look through that. I'm going to zip through the PowerPoint again a little bit to see, remember a few things. We looked at the determinants of supply. We graphed supply. We talked about elasticity. I want to stop for a second and remind you, okay, what's the difference between accounting profit and economic profit? Difference between accounting profit and economic profit. Opportunity cost, exactly. So the difference between accounting profit and economic profit is the opportunity cost. I might be making $200,000 a year using a building, but I could rent it out for $400,000. My accountants are happy. They tell me I'm making a profit, but the economist is going to say, well, wait a minute. By not renting out that building, you're actually leaving $200,000 on the table. That's going to be a very important concept, and we're going to come back to it tonight. We looked at the difference between the short run and the long run. The first one is that in the short run, capital is fixed. So you can add more workers, but you can't change your capital plant size. So as a refresher on this, imagine that you have a sandwich shop, and you find out that next week is homecoming, and there are going to be a lot of people in town. Well, you can hire more workers pretty much just like that. It's easy to hire new workers, but you can't just open up a new factory overnight or expand. It's going to take a little bit longer. That's going to be the long run. The second consideration is that in the short run, nobody can enter or exit the market. This is going to be another important question for us tonight. Whereas in the long run, everybody can enter or exit. Potential competition can enter or exit the market unless we have high barriers to entry. We'll come back to that. So continuing here, we talked about some of the basic concepts, changing marginal returns, how each worker is going to add a different amount than the worker before based on how many workers you have. This is all review here. Looked at the marginal product and how that's going to affect the total product. We looked at averages because each worker is going to produce a different amount, so we need to look at averages. And then we flip that all into cost, and that's going to matter here mostly for our marginal costs. Quick review. Why is the marginal cost curve first falling and then rising? Well, first, workers help each other. As you add more workers, each worker adds on more than the worker before. More productive workers is just another way of saying that the cost per unit is going to fall. But eventually, they start getting in each other's way. They're less helpful. They start bumping into each other. The marginal returns are falling. The marginal product is falling. And if the marginal product is falling, that means that it costs more and more to produce one more unit. So marginal cost is rising. That's going to be an important lesson for us tonight. So continuing, the last thing on the review that we have here, you've got this fancy graph, lots of colors. And the last thing on the review is that a firm will set its production at the point where marginal cost equals marginal revenue. Why? Well, the firm looks at this and says, well, if I could produce one more unit and earn more on that unit than the cost, then I'm leaving money on the table. I should produce more. On the other hand, if I'm at the point where producing one more unit is going to cost more than I get, I'm not going to pay $7 to sell an extra sandwich for $6. It's not worth it, so I'm going to stop production. So profit maximization is going to come at the point where the marginal cost is equal to the marginal revenue of production. This is all the review. We're going to come back to that in a moment. So this leads us to part 2. I intentionally went fast through this. This is all, it's posted on Canvas. This is last week's lecture, and if you've got any questions on it, you can let me know. But I thought I would start with a brief review of that because that's going to be the scene setter. So we've now looked at what happens. I'm checking the message board to see if there are any questions here. Okay, so we seem to be okay. We're now looking at part 2, and that's the market structure. So I really like having these 2 lectures back to back. I made one PowerPoint because when you're studying, you can look at all of them together. They're really 2 parts of the same thing, but they're covered over 2 nights. And you can see that they're posted in both lecture 5 and lecture 6 as the same document. So we looked at, I talked about this, utility given constraints. Likewise, the firm is going to try to be efficient internally, but that's not the entire story. You can be really, really good, as I'm going to say as an example later. I may be really good at producing typewriters, but I'm not going to make a lot of money because nobody's going to be interested in buying my typewriter. Likewise, the firm is going to have to figure out what kind of market it's in and make decisions according to those constraints. This is where the market environment comes in. The first question is going to be, how many sellers are there in the market? How big a market is this? Is it just one seller? Is it 2 or 3? Is it a handful? Or is it tons and tons, which is a fancy way of saying thousands? And keep in mind, potential sellers. I may be sitting pretty, I'm enjoying life, I'm a big monopolist, I'm making a lot of money, but I completely ignore the fact of competition. Look at IBM. In the early 1980s, people thought that IBM was a monopolist, and there was, in fact, an antitrust investigation that was started at the federal level. But IBM got kind of sloppy about its operations. It was the only one, it didn't need to worry, and then suddenly you get PC clones that are starting to be produced, and in the beginning, people might have been a little suspicious. It's not really an IBM. But then eventually, those took over, and now IBM doesn't even make computers anymore. It makes mainframes and has consulting services. So IBM got sloppy because it didn't look at the potential sellers in the market. So if you're in business, you have to look at not just your competition, but your potential competition. Who might come in, who might say, well, wait a minute, Wenzel's making a lot of money. I'm as smart as Wenzel. I can compete with Wenzel. I'm going to beat him in his own game. So I need to be aware of that. The second one is the degree of product differentiation. That's just a fancy way of saying how similar are the goods being sold. So, for example, what's that, sorry?
I said, what makes yours different that this one want to buy it?
Exactly. So repeating that, you have to know if you're producing the same thing as everybody else. So in some cases, like when I go to the grocery store and I buy my bread, there's a couple different kinds of bread, so that's a product differentiation. But I honestly don't know or care if the wheat comes from Michigan or Kansas or Ohio or Nebraska. Wheat is wheat. I really don't care about where it comes from. In fact, it's not even going to be on the package. And we see that also milk. So when you go to the grocery store, how many brands of milk do you typically have? Well, the product differentiation occurs on a different level because you have the organic milk and this and that. But you have milk, you generally have the store brand. And it doesn't say where the milk came from. It doesn't have the name of the cows. It doesn't have the name of the farmer. In fact, all the milk is dumped together into big vats and then sterilized and it's bottled. And then you buy it. You don't really care. Now, you might care that you want organic milk as opposed to traditional milk. That's a different story. But in terms of the milk, what's that, sorry? Or the lactose, that's going to be an example of product differentiation. But even within that, if you're buying your reduced lactose milk, you don't know what dairy farm it came from, and it doesn't matter. And the third thing that we're going to see is barriers to entry. So what kind of a market are you operating in? Is it easy for you to enter, or is it difficult for you to enter the market? So a low barrier to entry means that you might have 1 or 2 licenses, but it's generally a pretty easy thing, and you can start a business just like that. A high barrier to entry means that either you're going to have a lot of official paperwork to fill out, you might have to wait a long time, it might be almost impossible, but then in some countries you may even have to bribe an official in order to start your business. So based on that, on the market environment, we have 3 categories of industrial organization. The first one is competitive markets. And a competitive market, even if it's not perfectly competitive, a competitive market is simply a case where the market is so big and there's so many participants in the market that each one is pretty much insignificant. So everyone has to take a price. If poor farmer Bill from Washtenaw County, Michigan retires tomorrow, it will absolutely not be reflected in the price of your bread. He's no longer producing wheat, he retires, he's done, nobody knows because that market is so competitive. The second kind that you have is a market called monopolistic competition. That means that you have some characteristics. It's starting to look a little bit like a monopoly, but there's still competition. And this is technically known as a market with price searchers with low barriers to entry. That means that each individual firm producing is looking to make the price because it's got a differentiated product, but there are relatively low barriers to entry. That means that others can come in and compete by offering a product that is slightly the same. Third, monopoly. So monopoly is not the board game in this case with the guy with the funny the monocle. Monopoly is simply a case where you have a price searcher who's making a differentiated product, and there are high barriers to entry. That means that nobody else can enter. And we'll see that in some cases the high barriers to entry are economic, and in other cases they're going to be legal. But we'll come back and discuss all of those. And I'm going to go ahead.
Where does Microsoft fall in?
So the question is, where does Microsoft fall in? What's that, sorry?
They were accusing Bill Gates of going on monopoly one time.
Yep. So Microsoft was sued. So I think we can just answer the question immediately and say it's not a competitive market. You don't have 10,000 producers of operating systems. Now, the question is then, is it a monopolistic competition or is it a monopoly in the economic sense? And the question comes from a student. I'm going to lead the question a little bit. The question comes from a student with an Apple computer. So, are you operating a Microsoft product? No. So in that case, we have monopolistic competition. We have a price searcher, Microsoft, but there are others who provide. Now, I don't know enough about computers. I'm going to say there's at least, what, 3 or 4 operating systems?
Use Microsoft software. Okay.
Oh, you do? So you use Microsoft software on your Apple computer, but is your operating system the Apple? Or, so you've got the Apple operating system. Okay.
Mhm.
So in that case, we see that there's a small number of firms. We don't have perfect competition, but we don't have one single monopolist. We have a small number of firms that are offering very similar products, but they're different enough. Think also of your phones. What's your choice, basically? You can get an iPhone
Samsung.
or an Android, right? And so Samsung is one option. You could buy an LG. There's what about Microsoft has a phone. There's about, what, half a dozen? How many, roughly?
Yeah.
So there's not 1,000 different kinds of phones, but there's not one. So that would be a case right there of monopolistic competition. Let me check in on the chat.
I know they were being sued at one time.
Oh, yeah. Okay, let's see. So we jumped a little bit ahead of that. There we go. Okay, so we're okay on that. So the next question we have is, what's a price taker? So that was a very good point. Thank you on Microsoft. So we're falling in between. And that's going to be where it's going to be important for you as managers. So all these graphs, you as managers are going to want to know, are you producing the only product of its kind, in which case the only thing you need to worry about is potential entrants, or are you producing something that's similar but still different? Or are you producing something that everybody else produces? In all three of those situations, you're going to make different pricing decisions. So we look now first at price takers. And I was going to be a little silly here and say, what's a price taker? A price taker is somebody who takes the price. But there's more to it than that. So the definition is that a price taker is a firm that has to take the price for a good or a service that is determined by the market. The price taker does not have a choice. It has to take the price that's determined by the entire market, that is, by the entire set of consumers representing demand, and the entire set of suppliers representing supply. That's going to give us, this is my technical way of saying supply and demand, and that's going to yield a market price that has nothing to do with the individual, and I'll explain that by illustration in a moment. That's the price that the price searcher, it's take it or leave it, which means that the price taker does not engage in pricing decisions, and I'll give you an example in a moment. That the price taker is simply going to look at its own internal cost of production and the externally defined market price. The price taker cannot engage in pricing policy. It has to take the price that's defined by the market. So there are 4 conditions that define when a firm is a price taker or when an industry is a price-taking industry. All the firms are small enough that their actions have no effect on the market as a whole. So what happens, for example, if, what's the name of the coffee shop in downtown Fayetteville?
Coffee scene.
The coffee scene. Okay, let's say the coffee scene shuts down. What's going to happen to the price of coffee and the labor market in Fayetteville? Nothing. Fort Bragg shuts down tomorrow. What's going to happen to the labor market in Fayetteville? Okay, extreme examples. That's going to have a big impact. But in a price-taking situation, any one firm could just disappear tomorrow. Doesn't really matter. Now, some of you might object and say, well, in a market with Starbucks, the little mom and pop shops are actually different. Okay. But number 2, goods from different producers are completely fungible. Fungible simply means that they can be perfectly replaced. So even if it's close, an LG phone and a Samsung phone cannot be perfectly replaced. They've got different characteristics. They've got different levels of quality. However, soybeans from Nebraska versus soybeans from Kansas, completely replaceable. They're the same thing. Nobody cares. Third condition, I'm sorry, you have to have low information and transaction costs. That basically means that everybody knows about everything. You can't try to game the system and drive your tractor a mile down to another market, because the other market's going to have the exact same price for hogs or the exact same price for wheat. And number 4, free entry into the market and free exit from the market. Now let me ask you a quick question on this. Does that mean that automatically in a price-taking market, immediately somebody can come in and compete? What's the difference between the short run and the long run? So by definition, in the short run, nobody can enter. So this is only a long run condition. Now, as I said before, the short run, I'll take it, sorry. Okay. The short run and the long run are going to depend on the industry. A sandwich shop, the short run might be 3 weeks. It's still going to take time to get a new building going, to get the forms necessary, to get the healthcare inspection, the health certificate. But that's going to be a short run consideration of about 3 weeks. Opening up a car industry or a nuclear reactor could be 10 years. But by definition, in the short run, nobody can enter anyway. But in a price-taking market in the long run, anybody can enter or exit the market. Yes?
What do you mean by the free entry? I get the exit, but obviously the market doesn't make the pay fee to join it. But what does that mean?
Well, free entry would mean, for example, I've got a great idea. Federal Express is too expensive because it's only for express things. So I'm going to start delivering letters for people at a rate that's slightly lower than the post office. What's going to happen to me?
Federally get in trouble?
I'm going to go to jail because it's illegal. The First Class Postage Act says that only the post office is allowed to deliver first class mail. The exceptions are recent and they're only for packages. I cannot enter that market. Another example would be if I'm going to start manufacturing weapons systems. I'm going to get a call from the Department of Defense saying, you can't just sell weapon systems to foreign countries. You got to go through us here. So free entry simply means that you can enter the market and start competing. Now, the example of a sandwich shop, you still need to pay taxes. You still need to get a building inspection. That's easy enough that that's free entry. You don't need to pay a bribe. Hairstylist, free entry, except you're going to have to pass an exam in a lot of states.
Yeah.
So that's restricted entry.
Unless you do natural hair.
Yeah, so there are exceptions like that. And then there are court cases. I'll take your question in a second. There are court cases like that. What counts? So for example, in some shopping malls, you can pay to have your teeth whitened.
Mm.
Well, some states, the dental board has tried to shut that down, saying that those people are providing dental services without a license. In Texas, there's apparently, somebody can correct me on the biology and the details here, apparently horses' molars continue growing throughout their lives, and they need to be filed down by people called horse floaters. Okay, so I know nothing about horses, but it is. So people will just come in, they'll file down the horse's teeth, and everybody's happy. Well, the Texas Board of Veterinary Medicine tried to get these people shut down, claiming that they were practicing veterinary medicine without a license. So that's an example right there of barriers to entry. You had a question?
Yeah, question. Let's say this was a brand new product,
Yep.
never introduced it. How can the market set the price for this if they've never seen it or whatever? Like how, I hear that the market controls it, but when you introduce it, it's not similar to record. I got my costs. Who was the boss on that? How does that work?
Okay, so the question was, repeating for the recording, if you're bringing a new product into the market that nobody's ever made and it's something completely new, how's the market going to set that price? Well, two things. First of all, see condition number 2, that's not going to be a price taker in that case. So we'll get to that in a quick second. The second thing is, how's the market going to price it? The same way it prices everything else. The company is going to set a price, which could be right or wrong. If the company sets the price too high, it's not going to sell enough of the good, and they're going to be sitting on the shelves, so they're going to have to lower the price. And if the company sets the price too low, there's going to be a shortage of it, and there might even be fights breaking out, the way we saw with the Tickle Me Elmo dolls that came out in the 1990s, and the price was set wrong. So that's the beauty of the market. There's going to be slightly different in the price taker situation. It doesn't matter because you've got so many people. The market just kind of evolves based on what's going on. If there's a shortage somewhere, if people want more, but it's big picture movements. For the price searcher, we'll talk about that in a moment. You've got a new product.
So that's
the company is going to try to determine what the best price is, and we'll get to that in a quick second. Good question, thank you. So I keep on saying this, economics isn't perfect. It's a representation of the world. We call this the perfect competition model. It's not really perfect competition, but a lot of markets do come close enough that we can call it a perfect competition model. So let me look at the chat board now to see if there are any questions. Okay, I see none. Any questions for anybody here before we continue? Okay. So continuing with the price takers, let me give you a few silly examples, and you'll get the point very quickly. The wheat market as a whole, that is all of the farmers and all the consumers, probably indirect consumers, right? Because most of us don't buy wheat. We buy flour, we buy bread, we buy cookies, but we don't buy wheat. But all those things are going to affect the price of wheat. Let's say that because of all the supply and all the demand in the market, the price of wheat is at $5 a bushel. And that's actually about, I looked it up because I didn't want to say things like, oh yeah, let's say a Ferrari costs $25. No, $5 a bushel. Farmer Bill shows up at the market with his tractor. He's got 1,000 bushels of wheat. He's going to be able to sell that wheat at $5 a bushel. The first one and the 1,000th are going to yield him a price of $5. Next year, he gets ambitious and he brings one more bushel of wheat to the market. He sells that bushel of wheat for $5. He then, Farmer, that's embarrassing, I'll correct that. Farmer Bob employs the latest techniques. He's really good at producing wheat. He can sell his wheat for $5 a bushel. Farmer Sam retires. He no longer is bringing his 10,000 bushels of wheat per year to the market. What's that going to do to the price of wheat? Nothing. Still $5 a bushel. Now, big picture situation. What if you have massive droughts in the American Midwest? Okay, that's going to change the price of wheat. That's going to change the supply overall. But no one individual can change that. So let's say Farmer Bob is really crafty. I'm getting $5 a bushel for my wheat. I am going to withhold half of my wheat to try to drive the price up. By definition, nothing happens. Whether he sells 1 or 10 or 1,000 or 10,000 bushels, the price is going to be $5 per bushel. Now that also means, what's the marginal revenue? That is, if you sell 1 more bushel of wheat, how much more money are you going to make? $5. So the marginal revenue is going to be equal to the market price. By definition, it's going to be a flat line, because whether you sell 1 or 1,000 or 10,000 units, your marginal revenue is always going to be the same. It's always going to be the market price. In this case of wheat, it's going to be $5. So I could continue. In fact, I could leave a parrot here. $5, $5, and you just ask questions, and every time the parrot says $5. You get the point, I think, with the examples. So how does a price taker maximize profit? So if you are a manager of a price taking firm, how are you going to maximize your profit? Well, we already know what the marginal revenue is, right? It's the market price. Marginal revenue is the revenue that you get from producing 1 more unit. Every time you produce 1 more unit in a price taking situation, you get the market price. So if the price of wheat is $5 a bushel, a 51st bushel sold will yield a revenue of $5. Selling a 1,567th bushel will bring a revenue of $5. Every bushel, regardless of quantity, the marginal revenue from 1 more unit in this case will always be $5. That's easy. Marginal revenue is the market price. Market dictates the price. That's all you can do. That's all you know. Now we need to determine how much to produce. So let me ask you this. Would you bring an extra bushel of wheat to the market that would cost you $6 to produce if you can sell it for $5?
No.
No, that's bad business. On the other hand, if it costs you $4 to produce a marginal bushel of wheat, well, you should be producing more because you could be making more money by producing it at 4 and selling it at 5. So our definition here from part 1 is that the quantity, I put a nice little star there to indicate that that's the equilibrium quantity. The equilibrium quantity is going to be set at the marginal revenue equal to the marginal cost. And that's the kind of thing where if you get into a managerial situation and you're in charge of determining production, you can actually get those figures. You can actually get the figures. How much does it cost your factory, or how much does it cost your plant to produce 1 more unit? And then you can make your pricing decisions based on that if you are a price taker. Now the question is, what's profit? Well, profit is going to be the symbol pot. I guess the economists were not talking the day they came together with all the symbols. You can't use P for profit because P is already price. P is price, Q is quantity, and pi is profit. So I'm going to walk you through now. They're ultimately pretty easy. The first time this always seemed really complicated to me in intermediate micro and then in graduate school. So I'm going to break it down for you in 5 different steps. Some of you may think I'm going really slowly. Others may think, oh, okay, that makes sense step by step. So the definition of profit is easy. Total revenue minus total cost. I earned $100. It cost me $80. I made $20. Total revenue minus total cost is profit. Okay, so how are we going to calculate those? Total revenue is really easy. Price times quantity. How many did I sell? At what price? Boom, that's my total revenue. Now, total cost. That's going to be a little trickier because you remember each worker adds a different amount. You have first increasing and then decreasing marginal returns. So each worker is going to have a different level of productivity. I'm trying to carry a piano alone. Not going to work. If I add a second person, not going to work. I had a third and fourth person, suddenly we're able to carry 10 pianos during the day. So those people are adding a lot. But then if I have 30 people sitting around,
Too much.
you can have one person holding doors. But yeah, it's going to be too much. So that means that because, that's why I spent all this time on the revenue curves. We have first increasing, then decreasing marginal returns. That means that we have first decreasing marginal cost. It's cheaper and cheaper to produce one more unit. But then people start bumping into each other and you have to add more and more labor and they bump into each other, so it's more expensive per unit. So marginal cost falls and then increases.
Unless you have more pianos to move and putting people like, okay, 5 go over here, 5 go over there, so we all carry at the same time.
Sure.
One of them get in the truck and go.
But there are limits to that too, because depending on the industry, what if you have 500 people trying to carry 10 pianos? So it's going to depend again on the industry. And again, the diminishing marginal returns for sandwich making are going to be different from the diminishing marginal returns for car making. These are all general examples, but yeah, here. So because of that, how are we going to find the total cost if each unit has a different cost of production? Each unit has different marginal
And
cost.
we break them down and then add them up.
Exactly. What's another way of saying that?
Formula.
Averages.
Oh.
Break them down and add them up. That's why we have the trick. We use averages. So if I'm producing 20 sandwiches, and some sandwiches cost me $9 to produce because I'm just getting started, and other sandwiches produce me $2 to produce, what I'm going to be interested in at the end of the day is, on average, how much did each one of those sandwiches cost me to produce? That's the average total cost. So you take the total cost and you divide it by the quantity. But if you know the average, you can multiply the average by the total quantity, and that's going to give you the total. So how do you get the average? Take the total cost divided by the quantity. Total cost, 100 sandwiches divided by $20. That's going to be $5 per, so $100 over 20 sandwiches, $5. That's going to give you your average. Well, you just flip that quantity around. Total cost divided by quantity is equal to average total cost. Is the same thing as saying, here's the average total cost, multiply it by the quantity. That's going to give you the total cost. So put the two together. The profit is equal to total revenue minus total cost, which is equal to the price times the quantity. How many sandwiches did you sell at what price? Minus your total cost, which is the average, multiplied by the quantity. That's about as complicated as things are going to get tonight. I remember it was a little bit annoying when I first learned it. For some of you, it's going to make more sense graphically. For others, less sense. So I'm presenting it both ways. Let me look at questions here on the, okay. So this means, of course, that we can have 3 scenarios. As a reminder, we're in a situation of perfect competition. Perfect competition means there are low barriers to entry. Let's say we're all farmers. And suddenly I over here am making an economic profit on selling kale. When did kale become a craze? About 10 years ago? I'm always surprised, like 10 years ago, people didn't know what gluten was, and now it's bad for you.
I think I heard me personally, like,
So let's say 5-7 years ago, I'm a farmer and I read a lot of magazines, and I find that there's this new health food, power food called kale, and I decided I'm going to go into kale production. Nobody else is, and all the yuppies are buying it at, where is it, Whole Foods and Harris Teeter, and I'm making a lot of money. You guys are all farmers also. You've all got tractors, you've all got land, you've all got workers, you all know how to work the land. And you see over here, I'm making a lot of money producing kale that nobody else is. What are you going to do? You're going to jump in and produce kale also. And suddenly that's going to mean that my profits are going to dwindle down and disappear until my economic profits are zero. I can still make money. You can still make money. But my positive economic profit meant I'm the only one doing this. My resources are earning more than they could somewhere else. But then you guys start joining in because you're smart entrepreneurs. And by joining in, you're going to increase the supply in the market, which is going to drive the price down. So suddenly my super profits are going to fall as my price falls. And eventually, we're going to get to a point of normal economic profit. Normal economic profit is zero. That doesn't mean you're not making any money. It just means that your resources are not earning more than they could somewhere else. They're earning their opportunity cost. And that means in a price-taking situation, you're almost always going to have zero economic profits because it's easy to enter the market. If I'm producing kale, any one of you can enter the kale market. It's cheap, it's easy, there are low barriers to entry. Your kale is going to be just as good as my kale. So in a price-taking situation, we can anticipate that normal economic profits are going to prevail. Now, there are potentially two exceptions to this. The first one I just described. It's going to be relatively rare, but I might have an idea first. Before anybody else, I'm going to be the first one to produce kale. And I'm going to earn a profit temporarily in the short run until other people come in. So if I'm earning a positive profit, other people are going to come in, drive the supply up and the price down, as I just said, and eventually the price is going to be equal to the average total cost, which means zero economic profit. Eventually, the price is going to be driven down to the cost of production on average. So that means that it's going to be really, in the short run, you could earn a profit as a price taker. It's going to be rare because you're producing something that everybody else is. In the long run, it's never going to happen because by definition, anybody else can jump in. And by definition, anybody else has enough information about the market to come in and compete with you. Question?
Is there a way to secure that? Like, let's say, you know, the supply. Let's say you're the only supplier to so and so. Even though people enter the market, you still have your client.
Okay. So the question was, is it possible basically to continue having a positive economic profit if you've got a supply contract locked in? Not in a price-taking situation by definition. But we'll see in the price searcher case, yes. In the price taker situation, because by definition, everybody else is providing what you're doing. So let's say, again, it's kale, and I've got the supply to Whole Foods. Suddenly you come along and you offer a slightly lower price, whatever the market bears, that's going to be the price. So you cannot continue in that case. Good question. Second option, what if firms are earning less than, what if the firms are earning a negative economic profit? In other words, they're making an economic loss. Well, eventually what's going to happen, as soon as they can exit the market, some firms are going to drop out. Why would you stay in a market where you're losing business? So firms are going to drop out. That drives supply down. Lower supply means price goes back up, back to normal economic profit.
And then I come back.
Pardon me?
Then I come back to the market.
And then you might come back to the market. But good question. What happens if too many people come back to the market?
I stay.
Price is going to fall back down. So that's the whole thing with price-taking situations, is it's not going to be quite as interesting a market in some ways because you don't make the market price. The market as a whole does. people will respond. If they're earning a negative economic profit, some firms are going to drop out, which is going to bring the profit back to normal. If there's a positive economic profit, other firms are going to enter and compete. But the price-taking markets are generally going to be pretty stable because each individual business is so small that it's not going to have much of an impact. So the market as a whole, like the wheat market as a whole, could have fluctuations, like with Atkins diets and gluten-free diets, that's the market as a whole. But each farmer really isn't going to have an impact on the wheat market. So that's the easy part. We're going to graph this now. I spent so much time last week on these graphs because I wanted to break them down for you. Let's see how the resolution works on this. You get the general picture. So in all three of these cases, the marginal cost curve is purple, reddish purple. Different businesses are going to have slightly different looking marginal cost curves. It's going to depend, et cetera, but we always know that the marginal cost first falls and then it increases. Second, that horizontal yellow line, that's the marginal revenue curve. Why? Well, let's say that's the case of wheat, and wheat sells at $5 a bushel. If you sell 75 bushels of wheat at $5, and you bring a 76 bushel of wheat to the market, what are you going to make for that 76 bushel of wheat? $5. That means your marginal revenue is $5. And because your marginal revenue is always $5, regardless of the quantity, that's going to be a horizontal line. $5 always. So where do you produce? At the intersection of the marginal cost curve and the marginal revenue curve. That gives you your point of production. That's going to give you your quantity. What's the price? $5 in this case, whatever is set by the market. You now know your price and you know your quantity. So what's your total revenue? Price times quantity. So in all of these cases, the total revenue is going to be a rectangle that has the quantity as the base and the price as the height. So that brings us to the next question, which is what is going to be your cost of production? Well, how convenient. We happen to have in blue average total cost curves. And we know that price times average total cost is your total cost of production. You take the price, quantity. I apologize. Quantity times average total cost is going to be your price, your total cost. How many are you selling? So you're selling 100 sandwiches. Each sandwich had a different cost of production because of diminishing marginal returns. But on average, how much did it cost you? Multiply that by the total quantity of sandwiches that you sell. Boom. That gives you your total cost of production. So the total cost of production is also going to be a rectangle. That is, at its base, the quantity, and the height is going to be the average total cost. So we see here that that rectangle, it doesn't make sense for me to be pointing at the screen, but if you see that point where the average total cost curve hits the quantity, that is going to form the boundaries of the rectangle of total cost.
Can you do it with the mouse? I'm sorry.
Let's see if I can do it with the mouse. Smart. Thank you. Still learning here. Okay, so there's probably a fancy way to draw it, but let's do this. So in this case on the left, which is the easiest one, let's start first with the marginal cost curve, which is this. And we have our marginal revenue curve, which is horizontal. The intersection of the two is right here. So that gives us a rectangle here, which is a base of the quantity and a height of the price. That's your total revenue. The quantity right here at the point of intersection with the average total cost, that's going to give you your total cost of production, which means that your total cost is going to be, in this case, that exact same rectangle. What happens if total cost is equal to total revenue? They're both equal. What's profit? 0. So this case here, if price is equal to average total cost, then your economic profit is going to be 0. Two other scenarios. if price is equal to average total cost. So on average, you're breaking even in economic, because remember, we're including opportunity cost. On average, you're breaking even. Your cost of production on average is equal to the sales cost. No economic profit. So there are obviously two other situations. Price is higher or price is lower. If the price is higher, just without looking at the graph, think of it intuitively. If your price is higher than your cost of production, is that a good thing or a bad thing? Sales price.
Yeah.
It's great. That means that you are able to capture a sales price per unit that is higher than what it's costing you on average to produce. That's a good thing. That means you're going to be making a profit. In graphical terms, if we see right here, we have the marginal cost and the, oh, it's going to be in this, where's the price? There we go. Marginal cost and marginal revenue. So the marginal revenue is the horizontal curve. The marginal cost is the purple curve. Intersection of the two is going to give you your price and quantity. That's going to be your total revenue. And this smaller box right here, where the average total cost crosses the quantity, that's going to be your lower cost of production. And the difference between the two, this rectangle, is your economic profit. I'm not going to belabor the last one. The last one is the opposite situation, where you have average total cost that is higher than your sales price. That means that you're losing money in economic, you're running an economic loss. So in all these graphs, the purpose is not to make you professionals at graph drawing, but to think in terms of, are you able to capture a market price that is higher than your average cost of production? If so, you're going to make a profit. But very quickly, others will enter the market, drive down the price such that the price is equal to the average total cost, and you have a zero economic profit.
I'm thinking back to Apple. That's my Apple.
What's that, sorry?
The Apple
Mm.
iPhones are still prices.
But let's ask this. Is Apple a price taker or a price searcher? So, good example, but think back to your conditions. Does Apple sell something that is so similar to anybody else that you don't really care? It's a specialized product, so Apple can get away with that. On the other hand, if Farmer Bill tries to sell his wheat because, I don't know, maybe he was singing in harmony with his family, so he thinks the wheat has better energy, so he wants to sell it to you for $7 a bushel, nobody's going to buy it. Apple, on the other hand, Apple faces a downward sloping demand curve. Apple's a price searcher because it's producing something that's highly differentiated. It's different from other things, so Apple can do that. Good question. So one of the first things that you're going to need to determine in your business, are you a price taker or are you a price searcher? Okay. So I'm going to leave these graphs for now.
Either way,
Yeah,
though,
go ahead.
what I was gonna say,
Yeah.
whether you're a price taker or, you have to work harder if you're not gonna be a price taker, because you have to be so unique and so, you know, so all that, I mean, you earn the right to be,
Yeah.
you know, so.
So the comment here for the recording and for the synchronous students, is that a fun name? Is that basically, yeah, if you are a price searcher, you have to work harder providing something different, so that's kind of the market rewarding you. Now, of course, farming's hard work, but not in a strategic sense. Yeah, good. So in all of this, again, the textbook has got these graphs. You can ask me questions. Fundamentally, what I'd like you to take away from this is this notion that if you are making a profit, economic profit, as a price taker, other people are going to enter the market because they can and compete the price back down to zero economic profits. So that's the normal situation, is zero economic profits. So a couple concluding thoughts on price takers. I've intentionally skipped two things. One is the shutdown point, which is the point where a firm should stop its operations temporarily, kind of like seasonal things. You might have a beach in New Jersey where you've got a pizza stand that closes in November and then opens up again in May. Farmers markets, swimming pools that are closed for the winter time. They're not going to shut down their business completely, but they're going to stop production. And then the second thing that I've skipped is short run versus long run market supply, which is basically just going to be the marginal cost curve of the sum of the marginal cost curves of the firms. That's getting more technical than our purposes. So what are the takeaways here? First thing is, you better know if you're a price taker. Because if you're a price taker and you start trying to engage in pricing strategy, you're going to have a bad surprise pretty quickly. As I said, the crafty farmer Bill who decides that he's going to sell his wheat for more. Second thing, if you are a price taker, you're going to have to react quickly in the market, because you might be able to grab an economic profit if you have an innovative product temporarily, but others are going to come in and compete with you very quickly. Low barriers to entry mean any economic profits won't last. You have an expectation that as a price taker, you will be earning a zero economic profit. So what does that mean? You cannot increase your revenue through strategic pricing. So Farmer Bill can't say, okay, I'm going to sell my wheat for $7 a bushel, and that way I'm going to make more money. Or he can't say, I'm going to sell my wheat for $4 a bushel, and that way I'm going to sell more. $5. What's that, sorry?
He can find cheaper ways to produce it.
Bingo. So the comment was he can find cheaper ways to produce it. Yes, your only option is to improve internally. You cannot change the market price. You have to accept it. So what you could do is invest in a better tractor, invest in a better combine, invest in better seed.
Okay, I'll lay
Yeah. Make your children work for you. Yeah. So in all of those cases, your only option as a price taker is to improve internally. That's really what it is, because you're not going to be able to make a profit, an economic profit, as a price taker, because other people can jump into the market, and by definition, information is readily available, so people will do that and jump in. So that's an important thing for you to know. And if this were an undergraduate class, I would ask a trick question. If you are a price taker, how can you improve your profits through pricing strategy?
You can't.
The answer is simply that you can't. No, for a graduate class, I'm not going to mess with you like that, but that's the kind of question that I would ask to keep students sharp, right? Okay, let me check the message board over here, see how we're doing. Okay, so we seem to be okay. All right. Questions, comments?
We'll talk about this apple. So
Yeah.
the issue unique. Is there a patent on it? Why hasn't someone, okay.
So there are two answers to that, and in fact, if I may, so the question was, what's unique about Apple? Is there a patent on it? And the answer is slide 47. So we're about 9 slides away. So what I propose is that we continue, and I'll get to that question. I'll get to that question with the slides. Okay. So this is a dense lecture. It's probably total. We've probably got another 45 minutes. So we're about at the halfway point. Would you like a break now, or would you like to plow through for the rest of the last 45 minutes? We can take a 5-minute break now, or we can continue later. Okay, so we're going to take a 5-minute break. We will be back. I'm going to pause the recording. Okay, so we're back. We had 2 questions that surfaced during the break. The first one was a price taker question, and the second one was a price searcher question. So we'll start with the price taker question. I'm going to read the question. If you're a price taker, could you actually undercut the competition, maybe like during Christmas time? Okay, sorry, I got another menu. Could you actually undercut the competition and sell through your inventory and leave the competition to sell below cost? By very definition, and this is where, okay, so the economic theory gets a little tricky. If you are a price taker, you cannot do that, because by definition, you're so small and you're so insignificant that you cannot alter the price. However, you might end up finding that you actually have price searcher characteristics, in which case you can actually do that. But if you are a price taker, there's nothing that you can do in terms of pricing strategy, because it's so you're trying to undercut as a price taker. You undercut the price, consumers will simply go somewhere else. By definition, you're so small that you can't affect it. However, that question is going to be an important question when we come to price searchers. So what I'm going to do, because we had such a great question about price searchers during the break, I'm going to go through a slide of theory, and then we're going to ask a couple questions about and open it up to discussion here. So, oh, good, thank you. So the definition: a firm is a price searcher if it can search for price. Now, a firm is a price searcher if it can set the market price for the good or service that it produces.
Is that because they have a good market share?
We'll see in a few moments. Yep, I'll add a little bit to that question. So a price taker has to take the market price. A price searcher sets the market price. Why is it called a price searcher rather than a price setter? Simply because the price searcher has to search for the optimal market price. What is the best price? And I'll look at that. I'll explain that in a moment. It has to engage in a production decision, just like the price taker, how much you're going to produce. But it also engages in a pricing strategy. So the price searcher has to look at the market and figure out what is the optimal way to set the price. We'll come back to this commentary in a few moments. I was asking my department chairman 10 years ago how much I should charge for a lecture, and he said to me simply, remember, you're a price searcher. Oh yeah, well, I'm a price searcher, which means because, well, not to toot my own horn, there are a few economists out there, but the kind of product that I was delivering was specialized. I could determine the price, but I could have said $50,000. What do you think would have happened? Gig canceled. Or I could have set it at $5, in which case I would have lost a lot of money. But I had to set the price in that case. Yeah, exactly. Well, then you get into signaling, and so we'll come back to that. So here are the things. How do you set the price? You could set it randomly, but that's not how you're going to do it. A lower price means a higher quantity sold, but it also means a lower marginal revenue. So just as I said, so Apple could decide, haha, we're going to flood the market. We're going to lower the price of the iPhone to $50 per iPhone. But that means that it's only getting a marginal revenue of $50. Alternatively, a higher price means a lower quantity sold, but a higher marginal revenue. So companies are going to have to find the right balance between the two, and fear not, there's a formula for that too. But companies are going to have to find the right balance between setting as high a price as they can to increase marginal revenue, but also lower the price to increase the quantity sold. So they're going to have to find a balance between those two, and I'll come back to that in an example. And there are basically two conditions for a firm to be a price searcher. So I think this was the question that you had a few moments ago. The first one is firms sell differentiated products. The firm sells a differentiated product. Now, it could be hyper specialized, such that that firm is the only one making that product ever in the world. Or it could be somewhat differentiated. So think of cars, for example. Wheat, not differentiated at all. A fully differentiated product that nobody else in the world makes, it's actually going to be a little bit hard to find, because we usually find that there's something that's kind of like Boeing airplanes. There's a substitute for Boeings, but it's not perfect. What's a substitute for a Boeing airplane? Airbus. So an A320 versus a Boeing, and I'm probably going to get caught on this, versus a Boeing 757. Not a perfect substitute. They're both differentiated. They're highly differentiated. They have different characteristics. Or cars, for example. So you do care what car you buy. It's not like wheat. But on the other hand, there exists a difference between a Toyota and a Ford. Mm-hmm. It may not be super huge. They're both cars. They both get you from point A to point B, but they're still differentiated products. They're different. Unlike a trailer full of wheat from Michigan and a trailer full of wheat from Ohio, nobody's going to know the difference or care. Second condition is that firms face a downward sloping demand curve. Remember that with the price taker, the demand curve is horizontal, because it's always going to be, regardless of the quantity, the price is going to be the same. A price searcher faces a downward sloping demand curve, which means that if the price searcher lowers the price, quantity sold increases. If the price searcher raises the price, quantity sold decreases. It's a downward sloping demand curve. So basically what it comes down to is the price searcher has to find the optimal point on that demand curve. So I've got here 2 examples, and then we'll jump in with a conversation. Apple is the only company in the world that makes iPhones. There is no other iPhone in the world. So Apple could sell iPhones for $2,000 or even $10,000. It could do that. But nobody would buy them, or very few people would buy them. Or Apple could sell them at $50 each, and Apple could perfectly well do that, but it would not make a profit. So Apple has to decide where between $50 and $1,000 it's going to sell, because here's the trick. Remember I said highly differentiated products? Nobody in the world except for Apple makes an iPhone. If you love the iPhone, that's all there is. In other words, if you have an inelastic demand for iPhones. So it's a highly differentiated product that faces a downward sloping demand. But there are substitutes for iPhones. Here's one of them. It's called Samsung. I know. Some people will have an inelastic demand for Apple phones. Do you have an Apple phone? Apple? So if you have an inelastic demand for Apple phones, Apple is the only one that exists in the world, and you will pay a lot more for an Apple phone. But when I walk into the store, and my options are a super expensive Apple phone or a cheaper Samsung phone, I'm not going to buy the Apple phone. So Apple needs to be aware that even though it is selling a highly differentiated product, it still faces competition. It still faces competition from the Android series of telephones. And even within that, a Samsung phone versus an LG phone, and there's some Chinese company that's making super cheap smartphones. Those, again, are highly differentiated products. They offer different characteristics, different prices, different levels of quality, but there's still some competition. So it's not like there's only one kind of iPhone in the world. We still consider smartphones, to be differentiated products if they offer a different set of characteristics. So that's going to be what you have to think about. So the question earlier, I'll take that question and then come in another one. What happens if you've got a new product that's out on the market, nobody else is making it? You can set whatever price you want in theory, but you want to maximize your profit. So you don't want to set the price too high or too low. And if you set the price too high, you're going to lose some people who might have bought your product, but are going to go find some sort of a substitute instead. Question?
Okay, basically I was saying the case of Apple, if Apple could make like a lower costing, phone. I mean, like my daughter, she has a bigger one, and then there's a smaller one.
I'll repeat the question.
Like that, in terms of just to cater to, some other the requirement of customers.
Yeah. So the question
It's
is,
still Apple, but it's just a little cheaper than.
The question was, Apple could make multiple tiers of phone. So it could make its super Apple iPhone, and then it could make its medium, and then it could have a cheaper, simpler iPhone. 2 answers. The first one is, if Apple thought it could make more money, it probably would have done that already. Why do you think Apple did not or has not done that?
Exclusivity.
Exclusivity. Part of the signal is you're selling an Apple. It's not like, okay, we're going to sell an Apple, but it breaks down all the time. No,
I'm talking
you're getting.
in terms of, like you said, that the competition increasing
Yep.
before they lose it or lower themselves all the way down. They could go as a result to a lower.
So Apple could go to a lower and cheaper product, but Apple has made the calculation that it's going to make more money if it sells only the high-level product, because one of the things that people are buying when they buy an Apple is the name. So let's take an example with luxury cars. Would you be really excited to drive what's a luxury car that you guys might enjoy?
Well, people are driving Chrysler 300 when it looks like a Bentley.
But
Yeah, I hate that.
And what are you signaling? You're signaling, okay, but it's not really a luxury
I
car.
can afford it, but it's not.
It's like, so people would not, for example, people would not buy the $12,000 brand new Ferrari. And Ferrari's not going to say, okay, we're going to make some of our luxury sports cars. We're also going to make a $12,000 Ferrari, and the doors might fall off occasionally, and it doesn't really get, well, who cares about the mileage when you're buying a Ferrari? But it's not going to be a very good quality car. That's going to damage the brand reputation of Ferrari, and it's also going to mean people aren't going to want to buy real Ferraris because it's no longer as interesting to set yourself apart. So,
It's like
So let me-
romance. It still looks.
So let me ask you this, so these, because I don't know anything about Apple, to be honest with you. So, because like I said, my daughter has this big phone, iPhone, and then my little one has a smaller one, and the small one is cheaper than the big one. So that's not.
are they both Apple products?
Yes.
Okay, so here,
They do the same thing, only the small.
No, but I'm saying price.
okay,
wise. That's
so-
what
The
I'm-
small is cheap.
That's what I'm
That's all
saying.
the reason.
So here's
But that's exactly what that's my point I was trying to make. So it's
Like
still
the
doing
same
the same
quality,
thing,
but
same
less
quality.
expensive.
both quality. So here's the thing, with Apple, hypothetically, Apple could have 20 different kinds of phones. Apple has that capability, and you could get the super duper Apple phone and then the Apple phone that doesn't really work. That's bad for business because it's diluting its product. What it can do, what you pointed out, I'm sorry I misunderstood, it can sell 2 or 3 different kinds. They're still all Apples, they're still fancy, they just might have different features, and it comes out with new brands periodically. So it's the iPhone 7, the iPhone 9, the iPhone 13, whatever it is. So even within that, a company can still break down its products, but it's going to be super cautious about selling the entry level. Okay.
Well, they just,
Good.
they just released the iPhone.
Yeah.
And they're all, one's 800, 800, and 1,000.
Boom. So there's going to be within a brand. Whereas on the other hand, if you're at the entry level of the market, what you might want to do is you can have the entry level plus. You could have the $100 iPhone, the $100 smartphone, 150, 200 to appeal to a different segment at the bottom of the market. Okay.
Yeah, because those different numbers, there's something, I could go to a
Yep.
store, something said $10 versus
Mhm.
$9.99, I will give the $9.99 just for what I
Yep.
mean,
But it's also, so the example was, in this case, you're sensitive to price. So you've got an elastic demand. If you're a tech geek, you're going to get the Apple, period. If you love luxury cars, for example. So I drive around, I've got a 10-year-old Ford, maybe it's 11 years old now. I'm eventually going to replace it with a 3-year-old Ford or maybe splurge a little bit on a Mazda. I'm not spending huge amounts of money on cars because there are other things that I prefer to, my retirement is one thing, but I prefer travel, pizza and beer. I prefer nice wines. I prefer books. I'm not going to spend a lot of money on cars. I've got an elastic demand for cars. I have a friend, however, who's also a professor. He's at a different school. He leases a luxury car every 4 years because he likes to drive a new car. So we went from a BMW 7 Series to a new Corvette, and it wasn't arriving. I mean, why don't you just go buy your Corvette? He says they're still putting it together because he had it custom built. That's his preference. He has an inelastic demand. But then you look at his apartment, you know, he's a professor, he's making solid money. He lives in a tiny little place, and he doesn't cook for himself, and that's his preference. So that's exactly when we face a downward sloping demand curve, because you're producing the only one, you need to figure out if your audience, your consumers, have an inelastic demand or elastic demand. That's more of what next week's lecture is, but those are good comments. Thank you.
Kind of reminds me of Rolex. Because there are other substitutes in the
Yep.
market, but it's no matter how much you save buying, another one, it's not Rolex.
Yep. So the question, the example in this case was the Rolex, and I don't think the microphones are picking up. That's why I keep repeating things. A Rolex is a Rolex. You wouldn't be proud showing your friends that you have a $12 Rolex. Now, there are knockoffs. They're illegal. They probably don't look quite as good, but if you're going to buy the Rolex, part of what you're buying is what you're buying. Oh, so here's a quick puzzle for you, and then we'll continue here. When the price of gold falls, we would expect the quantity demanded of gold to go up, except there's one exception. When the price of gold falls, the quantity demanded of gold engagement rings falls also, which is counter to economic science. But on the other hand, unless you're proposing to an economist, you probably don't want to say, honey, look at this ring that I got it for half price. That's not the kind of signal you want to be sending. So when the price of gold falls, there tends to be an increased demand for platinum and other platinum, silver, et cetera. So that there are exceptions in terms of what you're signaling. But that's part of what the price searcher is going to look for, is what kind of elasticity of demand there is. But, so you're a price searcher. You now understand that you want to maximize your profit. You're facing a downward sloping demand curve. How are you going to do this? Well, you're going to look at this. Maximize your profit. Quantity is easy. Whether you're a price searcher or a price taker, your production quantity is going to be set at the point where marginal cost is equal to marginal revenue. That's an internal consideration. You don't want to produce at a point where the next unit costs more to produce than you're going to get, and you also don't want to be leaving money on the table. That's easy. Marginal cost comes from the marginal cost curve. That's easy. We already know that it's a U shape. Now, marginal revenue is going to be a little bit tricky. Not very tricky, but a little bit tricky. And I'll explain it in theory, and then I'll give you an example. If you are a price taker, every single unit that you sell is going to have the same marginal revenue because you need to take the market price. But for a price searcher, we're going to see that marginal revenue falls as the price falls. Because if you're a price searcher, you're going to try to lower your price to increase your quantity sold. But that's going to mean that as you're lowering your price, you're getting less and less marginal revenue. You're selling more, but each individual unit is bringing less. Let me illustrate that with a theory and then an example. If you lower the price, there are going to be two consequences. The first one means that a lower price means you're selling more. That's going to tend to drive up your revenue. At the same time, a lower price means that your revenue is also going to be falling because the sales price is falling. So there are upward pressures and downward pressures. How can we figure this out? And the bottom line is the marginal revenue curve is going to lie below the demand curve because the price searcher is going to have to lower the price on all the units sold and not just the last one. Let me explain that with an example and then come back to that if there are any questions. So we have a price searcher selling at a price of $10, and at $10, the market will bear a quantity of 10. If the price searcher lowers the price to $9, what do we expect is going to happen to the quantity? You lower the price, you're going to sell more. Price falls to $9, quantity increases to 12. But what does this mean? Even though the new price is $9, the marginal revenue is going to be only $8. Why? Let's walk through this. So originally your revenue was $100, right? Look at the top of the screen, a price of $10, a quantity of 10. I made it easy on myself. 10 times 10, you're bringing in $100. Now you're bringing in, if you lower the price, $108, 12 times 9. So your marginal revenue from selling one more unit goes from $100 to $108, which is a marginal revenue of $8. So here's the puzzle. Wait a minute. You lowered your price to $9, but you're only bringing in $8. How can that be? And the reason is your revenue just went up by $18. Why? You sold 2 more units. You lowered the price to $9. You sold 2 more units. You made an additional $18. But at the same time, you're also losing $10 because every one of those 10 units that you sold, you're selling for $1 less. You just made $18 from selling 2 more units. You lost $10 because you had to lower the price on all of them, plus 18 minus 10. That means that your marginal revenue is $8. Notice, a demand curve is going to give us the relationship between the price and the quantity. But the marginal revenue is going to fall faster than the price because you're lowering the price on all the units you've sold, not just the last one. So that numerical illustration I find, you can look here at the theoretical illustration, but I think the numerical illustration makes more sense, and it explains to you that if you're a price searcher and you're lowering the price of a good to try to sell more, you're going to sell more, so you're going to increase your marginal revenue, but you're also losing because you're lowering the sales price on all the units, not just the last one. That means that you're still increasing your marginal revenue, but it's falling below the demand curve because marginal revenue is falling lower than price. So
You only do that if there's a supply too high. When you're trying to break down the supply, but you don't want to stuff them.
Well, here's the thing.
Do that just to make something out of nothing.
We'll get to that in a quick second. So here's what you're asking is basically preempting my next point. So we'll get to that. What we want to know is how much to produce. You produce at marginal cost equals marginal revenue. So you put the two together, set your marginal revenue equal to marginal cost, and we know what the marginal cost curve looks like. It dips and then goes back up. The marginal revenue is going to be a downward sloping curve below the demand curve for the reason I just explained. So that's going to give us the intersection, and I'll graph that in a second. And then the second question we need is, how do we get the best price? What is the optimal sales price? Well, let's see. We now have a quantity. We got the quantity at the point where marginal cost equals marginal revenue. And we also have a demand curve because we know the demand curve of the market. We have a quantity and we have a demand curve. What's that going to give us? Let me phrase it another way. What does the demand curve represent? Price. The demand curve represents the relationship between price and quantity. We know quantity, we know the demand curve. That gives us the price. So if we look at this, I'm going to zip forward to a graph, and then I'm going to come back to the three scenarios. So here we've got the graph. We've got the marginal cost curve. In this case, looks like this, just like the price taker, because that's an internal thing. We've got the marginal cost curve. This is the market demand curve right here. We also know, for the reason I just explained, that the marginal revenue falls below the demand. So the marginal revenue is going to be a downward sloping demand curve below the demand. So how do we set our quantity? Well, marginal cost, right here, equals marginal revenue. That's going to be the quantity that you set. You drop below the point where marginal cost and marginal revenue intersect. That's going to give you your quantity. Now we know the quantity and we know the demand curve. So how do we get price? Take that quantity right here, follow it up all the way to the demand curve. That's going to give you your price. So that is the basic graphical illustration. Again, we can have three different scenarios. So let me back up with that, and then I'll come back to the graph. Three different scenarios. A firm could be earning a positive economic profit. It could be earning zero economic profit, or it could be earning negative economic profit. So let me back to your question. I come up with a new product that everybody loves. Nobody else is making it. I sell it on the market. I know where to set my marginal cost and my marginal revenue. I'm able to determine the demand curve, so I set the price. I am able to set a price that is higher than my average cost of production. I win. I'm making a positive economic profit. Now, it could also be that I'm a price searcher, and I am the best manufacturer. In fact, I'm the only manufacturer of typewriters. What do you think is going to happen? Negative, in fact, right? What is the market demand curve for typewriters? So I'm not going to be able to set a price that is anywhere near my cost of production. Unless you sell it to what, sorry? Yeah, the courthouse still seems to use them. You might be able to sell some to a museum. But if you're selling something that people don't want, you're going to be making an economic loss because your cost of production is going to be higher than the sales price that you can have. Third situation, I'm the first person ever. This is fun about being a professor because I can invent things about myself. I'm the first person ever to invent the iPhone. I'm Steve Jobs. And I invent the iPhone, and I've got my downward sloping demand curve, and I set the production at marginal cost equals revenue, marginal revenue, and I'm able to set a high price because I'm the only person to make a smartphone. This is the year 2000, 1999 maybe, 2000, oh no, I'm sorry, 2008, 2009. I'm going to be making an economic profit. This is awesome. I'm the only person in the world making a smartphone. But what are you guys going to do if I'm making an economic profit? You're going to try to make one too. Now, I'm going to try to sue you to stop you from doing it because I don't want you coming into my economic profit. But here's what you're going to say. My phone's an Android phone. It's like the iPhone, but it's not really like the iPhone. It's different. It operates differently. It's got a different operating system. So eventually, you're going to be able to compete, and you're going to drive down that economic profit back to zero. So even though I'm making this special product, I'm not going to have an economic profit if other people are able to come in and compete. Now, a couple of situations that we'll talk about. I'll talk about it in general terms, then I'll come back to the specifics. If I'm making an economic profit and you're trying to come in and compete with me, what am I going to try to do? Stop you. Maybe through legal means. Maybe I'm going to try to buy up all the transistors so that you can't compete. I'm going to do whatever I can to try to keep you out. That's called a barrier to entry. So if we have high barriers to entry, I can continue making my profits as long as I want. However, if I cannot prevent you from competing with me, and in fact, that's what we saw. How long did the iPhone last as the only phone? Maybe 2 years? 2-3 years is the only smartphone out there. And then you had the Android come out. And then eventually you have now, what, 6 or 10 different manufacturers of smartphones. So Apple was able to corner that market completely and try to keep the others out. In fact, there was a lawsuit, as you pointed out. But eventually others came in and competed. Now, they might not be competing exactly on the same margin because there's some product differentiation. Apple is known to be a better quality product. It's also sort of a cult product. People love their apples. Go ahead.
No, I was just saying definitely some of his clients.
Yeah, oh yeah, most definitely. I'm not an early adopter of technology. There's no way I would pay $1,000 for a smartphone. I went in, I think it was 4 years ago, I bought my first smartphone. I bought the cheapest one that was available. And it didn't work terribly well. It broke after a year. So the next time I went in, I spent a little more money, so I would get one. I bought a Samsung that was a better quality product than what I initially had. Still not going to pay $1,000 for an iPhone because there are different options available. So we have 3 different scenarios. Scenario number 1, a firm could be earning a normal economic profit. With low barriers to entry, this is typically going to be the case because even if I'm making a highly differentiated product that people like, and I'm facing a downward sloping demand curve, somebody else is going to try to compete with me, as is the case with iPhones. The second possibility is a price searcher could be operating at a loss. Just because you're a price searcher, just because you're making something that nobody else makes, doesn't mean that anybody's going to want to buy it. As I said, I could be the price searcher selling typewriters. I'm making a highly differentiated product. It's 1974, and I'm making a lot of money. But eventually, early 1990s roll around, personal computers get cheaper and cheaper. Just because I'm the only one making typewriters doesn't mean I'm going to be able to make a profit. So eventually, I may be really good, but that demand curve is so low that I cannot get a price of production that is equal to or higher than my average cost of production. I'm going to go out of business. Third possibility, a firm could be operating at a profit. Apple for 2 years. If you are able to keep out the competition, maybe because you discovered, and Daryl, this was your example and initially, if you invent something new, you've got a discovery, you're the only one making it, you can make an economic profit. You can earn more on your resources than they could be earning somewhere else. But in the long run, others are going to try to enter the market. If they successfully enter the market, you will lose your economic profit and we'll go back down to zero. You can still make a lot of money, but you'll lose your economic profit because your resources will be making only what they could be making elsewhere. However, if you can prevent other people from coming in, you can continue to earn those economic profits. The first situation where other people come in and compete with you is called monopolistic competition. That's what we see in most industries. Cars, cell phones, etc. Each one is a different product. It's not a perfectly competitive market like wheat. Each one has a downward sloping demand curve, but we still see 2, 3, 4, 5 different companies producing. If you are able to prevent others from entering the market, then you have a monopoly. In that case, you can continue earning economic profits as we go on. So let me check the board and then graph these things for you.
I got a question, sir.
Sure.
Okay, so monopolies are supposed to be illegal by government, right?
Well-
If they have one phone company, you need to have a choice in that.
Sorry, I'm trying to find that. Go ahead.
You said well, so you know where I'm going.
No, please continue.
I'm basically there. If Apple is monopoly, is that true? Is it kind of, or what? If they got a product that's different, they got a patent, you can't get close to it, that monopoly?
So the question was, monopolies are supposed to be illegal. And the government, under the Sherman Antitrust Act, can't tell you the year, breaks monopolies. And the government actually, like Exxon used to be Standard Oil. And the government came in and said, okay, you're a monopoly, we're breaking you up. There's a couple answers to that. There are some cases where we'll see the barrier to entry is just that nobody else is good enough to copy your technology. In that case, tough cookies. People are still allowed to come in. You're not doing anything bad, you're just smarter and better. Maybe you own all the resources. So apparently, this is where I'm going to sound really dumb. Again, maybe. The screens on cell phones require rare earth metals, so that when you have a touch screen and it's the last column in the periodic table of the elements, and that's all I can tell you right there. Let's say you own all of those because you bought them all up ahead of time when nobody wanted them. You own them. That's that. It's only in cases, so the government can't really break that. What the government's going to try to do is break that if you take advantage of your monopoly position, or if you try to elbow competitors out.
Take advantage by running up the price?
Well, here's the thing.
So what do you think,
There's-
$1,000?
There's no monopoly on Apple to the extent there's no monopoly on Apple to the extent that there's no monopoly on cell phones, on smartphones. You can still buy an alternate cell phone. That's the equivalent of saying you have the option of buying a $200,000 custom-made BMW or a $15,000 Toyota or Honda that's off the rack. You have that option. BMW is making a better product. It's more expensive. They've got the monopoly on German touring cars, if you consider Porsche to be a sports car or whatever. So something, come back to me with Audi, et cetera. But they're the only ones producing that, but there are other cars available, so that's not a monopoly. So the three conditions are, so first of all, maybe nobody else is able to compete with you. And then the government,
That's not your fault.
it's not your fault. The second thing is, if you're playing dirty, or if you're trying to lower the prices to undercut the competition, that's typically when the government's going to step in. Or if somebody is trying to break into that industry and you suddenly drop your prices and sell at a loss, that's where the government's going to step in. And the third thing is, most monopolies in the US are actually supported by the government. That is, the government will grant you a license. Isn't that crazy? So if you look at certain things like taxis, the taxi monopoly, and I'll come back to this with Uber as an example, a lot of towns have allowed Uber to compete. But a lot of towns have also said, Austin, Texas is an example. It is illegal to drive an Uber in Austin, Texas. And they're never going to come out and say that they're trying to protect the taxi monopoly. They're going to say that it's for safety reasons, because the drivers don't have that background check. Uber is illegal in Spain. Uber is illegal in Germany. And basically what they're trying to do is they're trying to protect, and who's granting that protection? It's the government, because the government's going to send the police out and arrest the Uber drivers. So in fact, Uber's got an interesting strategy on this. If you read on this, let me know. Uber will actually send drivers into places where it's illegal, pay their fines for them, with the idea that eventually there's going to be such a backlash because people have gotten used to taking Uber that they're going to push against the local government. Interesting strategy. So your question there is sometimes, and without getting into the intricacies of the laws that I don't know, sometimes it's just simply, hey, you're welcome to compete with me. Sure, go ahead and go ahead and build a spaceship. Be my guest. But I'm the only one really who's doing it right now, so I'm the only one who's going to be selling it. Go ahead and build airplanes in such a way that you can make a profit. Fine.
So it's really not a true monopoly.
Yeah.
You get another word.
Yeah.
for that, but they use
So-
monopoly.
Yeah, and then the question is then, are there potential entrants? Are people allowed to enter? Are they not allowed to enter? But other times, here's what might happen. you are a company and you earn, I'm going to get the percentages wrong because I don't know the law, but let's say I'm a business, I own 40% of the market, and I'm going to try to buy another company that's only 20% of the market, but then with 60%, I can set pretty much the price I want. That's when the government might step in and say, no, we're going to block that sale because we don't want you to become a monopolist. So there are different cases when you break that down, but so sometimes it's just people are welcome to compete. Other times the government's going to block you from purchasing. In the Microsoft case, what they were doing is Microsoft was bundling. So they would sell you a computer, but you had to use the operating system with the Microsoft Internet Explorer. You couldn't use it with anything else. That's where the government stepped in.
I often wonder why, like, when cable companies say, like, Time Warner sells the Spectrum, why they don't. You just answered. That's why they everything's gonna just wait.
Don't even get me started on cable companies. Cables are interesting because there's a big debate about this. Our cable, a lot of times you can't even, there's no competition. But that's because there's no license issued. So the government is actually promoting cable monopolies in a lot of cases because I'm going to go out for lunch with my buddy the senator, and I'm going to buy him a nice lunch, etc. But so we'll come back to that. So graphically speaking, and let's see, we've got about 5 more slides here. Graphically speaking, remember I mentioned the quantity is going to come from the intersection of marginal cost and marginal revenue. Take that quantity all the way up to the demand curve, and that's going to give you price. So what is price times quantity? What's that known as? Price times quantity is what, sorry? Revenue. So your revenue is going to be this rectangle, price times quantity. What is your total cost? Well, that's quantity times average total cost. So in this case, we see that the cost, CB, quantity, origin, this small rectangle, the total cost is less than the total revenue. What does that mean? You're earning a profit. You're earning an economic profit, and in fact, this makes sense because your sales price, P right here, is higher than your average cost of production, so A is higher than B. You are able to sell at a price that is higher than your average cost of production. Yay, life is good. You are making an economic profit. Others are going to try to enter the market. If they're able to, they're going to drive the price down to the point where it is equal to average total cost, and you just lost your economic profit. So here, PQ, notice, intersection of marginal cost and marginal revenue gives you quantity. Take quantity up to the demand curve, that's going to give you the price. So price times quantity is equal to average total cost times quantity. In this case, 0 economic profits. So if there are low barriers to entry, and in a moment we'll just step away from the graphs and talk about it in the words again. If there are low barriers to entry, you're going to go from the situation on the left here over to this situation here because other people have entered the market and taken away the economic profits. If, however, the barriers to entry are high, you can continue to earn an economic profit as is indicated on the left here. Right-hand scenario, you're actually earning a loss. In this case, you're a monopolist. Let's say that I engrave the Declaration of Independence on a grain of rice, and I want to prevent everybody else from doing that, so I call up my uncle who's a senator. My uncle's not a senator, but hey, I just invented the iPhone about 20 minutes ago, so I'm allowed to have an uncle who's a senator. I call my uncle who's a senator, and he prevents anybody else from doing that, from engraving the Declaration of Independence on a grain of rice. I'm still going to lose money, even if I'm the only person in the U.S. producing this, because nobody wants to buy my good. In other words, my price of sale right here at point B is below my average cost of production. So it's possible for a price searcher, possible for a monopolist to lose money if that price searcher cannot get a sales price that is equal to or greater than the average total cost of production. So I'm going to check the board for questions, and then we're going to wrap up with words because I think we've had enough pretty pictures for today. Let's see. So somebody said Bugatti.
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay, so we have a question here about price searching. Okay, so we're going to switch now to some words. We've had the graph. Why did I have the graph up there? Visual representation. Visual representation of the fact that it is possible for a monopolist to lose money. And it really depends on the situation, the price they're able to capture. So here's the question about barriers to entry. First of all, in the short run, can anybody enter or exit the market? No. By definition, you cannot. Second, in a price taker market, by definition, the barriers to entry are low. Anybody can enter. Here we're going to look at barriers to entry. We've already talked about a few because this is going to determine whether a price searcher is able to continue earning economic profits in the long run. That is, if the price searcher can prevent other people from coming into the market, that price searcher can continue earning economic profits. Which means if you are a price searcher earning economic profits, you're going to have to ask yourself what you're willing to do to try to keep the competition out. Now, in some cases, the government's going to come knocking at your door and say, you can't do that. In other cases, the government is going to say, we really appreciate your campaign contribution, wink, wink, so we're going to make sure that nobody else can compete with you. Lobbyists, exactly. So there are different ways, and this is one of the things that you as managers are going to have to ask yourself. Will you be willing to use the government to advance your own business at the expense of others? Do you think that's ethical? That might be a question for an ethics class, but that's something for you to keep in mind. Are you willing to use the power of government to prevent other people from competing with you? So here are some examples of barriers to entry. The first one could be specific assets or resources. You've got the only computer engineers who know how to make an iPhone. Nobody else can compete with you. That's a big barrier to entry. Even if I were allowed to, I wouldn't know how to make a smartphone. Eventually, other people caught up. Resources is the same thing. Maybe you signed a 10-year contract for exclusive rare metal blah, 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 chemical symbol blah, blah, blah. But that's required to make smartphones because nobody else was interested. You locked in a 10-year contract. Nobody else is going to be able to compete. You already bought it. Second, economies of scale. This means that legally, I could open up a car manufacturer tomorrow. But it's not going to make sense to produce 500 cars a year or 1,000 cars a year. It's only going to make sense to produce tens of thousands of cars per year because of the magnitude of the assembly lines that are required. So you're going to have economies of scale. It's going to be very hard for people to break in because you already have to be an established big business. Second, reputation effect and experience goods. This is a little bit what we were talking about with the iPhones earlier. A newcomer comes into the market and wants to compete, but you don't know the reputation of this new person. So you're willing to pay more for the existing one, and it's going to take a while to develop a reputation. Interestingly, this changes over time. So made in China today is generally equated with pretty low quality stuff. But keep in mind, Hyundai, respected car, Daewoo, respected. No, I mean in terms of household electronics, I think it is. I don't think Daewoo makes cars. And I'm trying to think of the third. But there's a couple of South Korean companies today that make perfectly respectable, high quality goods. In fact, I wonder if Sony's Japanese. I think Samsung may be Korean. No, so what I'm saying is that it took a while. Now Korean goods are generally well respected. 15 years ago, they were considered to be junk. Japanese goods in the 1950s were considered to be junk. By the 1970s, they were considered to be high tech. So who knows, 20 years from now, made in China may be, oh, wow, made in China, great. Who knows, depending on how China develops. But that's a question with the reputation effect as a barrier to entry. You're welcome to compete, but it's going to be really hard for you because the other guy already has a reputation as being good. Learning curve effects. again, you can't just make something immediately. It takes time. This is similar to economies of scale, but it's not a question of size. Let's say that I'm a price searcher and I've been making phones or electronics for 20 years. I've got the bugs figured out. I know what mistakes I made. I can fix things. You're a new entry to the market. You don't know all that yet. So it's going to be super expensive for you and hard to break into that market. Exit costs. In some cases, it's really easy to shut down a company. I shut down my sandwich shop. I don't renew my lease. There's a vacant, boarded up shop in downtown Fayetteville, problem solved. But what if it's really hard to exit the market? What if I've invested millions of dollars in specific equipment and I can't sell it? Well, I'm going to keep that in mind before I open up a business and invest all that and think the exit costs are so high that I'm going to be reluctant to enter the market. In fact, in France, definitely, in Germany, I think, there are high costs to shutting down factories because you've got to continue paying the workers' salaries for, I think it's full salary for a year and part salary for another 4 years as part of the welfare benefits that they get, which sounds good if you're a worker. But then if you're a company, you're thinking, well, wait a minute. I'm not going to enter that market because I don't want to be stuck with that liability if I have to shut down. So that's going to be a high exit cost, means it's going to be a barrier to entry because you're worried about what might happen. And then the final one, back to your original question, patents and licenses. So if I invent something, I can get a patent on it and nobody's allowed to compete with me for a while. Pros and cons to that, I don't want to have a long discussion on it right now, I want to wrap up here. On the one hand, patents are good because they encourage people to invent things and they give them a reward for what they did. On the other hand, they block the market. So there might be an awesome new cancer drug, but there's a patent on it for 12 years. Nobody's allowed to compete and make it generic. So there are pros and cons to patents. And then, of course, there's a situation, as I mentioned, where you have to be licensed in the state of Louisiana to sell flowers. You have to be licensed in most states to cut people's hair and spend 2,000 hours of training. That's a barrier to entry, and that's intentional because they're trying to keep people out of the market. And here's some examples. I think I mentioned already. In Austin, it's illegal to drive an Uber. Even controlling for federal safety and environmental permits, you can't just open a nuclear power plant overnight. That's a technological barrier to entry. You're welcome to jump into the car industry, although the other companies might try to shut you down if you get too powerful, but incumbents have an advantage. It's really hard to compete in the car industry at a small scale, which means you have to build your way up to a large scale. It's kind of like that old joke. You know the best way to make $1 million in the wine business? Start with 2 million. Yeah. So that's sort of the thing with the car industry. The only way you're going to survive and you can enter is if you start big, but you can't really start big. That's why we see so few new car companies emerge. People love their Apple products. We said that. Here's the thing. There is competition for Apple. It's not a perfect monopolist. But on the other hand, people love their Apple so much when they love them, inelastic demand curve, Apple is basically able to continue competing. And then finally, let's say I want to enter the steel business, but all the existing firms have already locked in a 10-year contract on iron. It's going to be really hard for me to enter and compete. So a few final closing commentaries. It is possible for a price searcher to earn an economic profit in the short run.
Is it possible for a price searcher? Yes.
Yeah. It is possible for a price searcher to do so. If you are able to produce something and sell it for more than your average cost of production, in the short run, you can make an economic profit. Now, if there are low barriers to entry, other firms are going to enter the market. The increased presence in the market is going to decrease the demand for your good. That's going to decrease your sales price. Eventually, you're going to come back down to that point where price is equal to average total cost. People have competed away the economic profits. You're back to zero economic profits. If there are high barriers to entry, on the other hand, nobody else can enter the market. Maybe because it's illegal, maybe because it's too hard. Whatever the case may be, you can continue earning economic profits in the long run only if there are high barriers to entry. Otherwise, others will come in and compete down those profits for you. So, wrapping up here, we have monopoly. So Here we are. Two situations: monopolistic competition, price searchers, some competition, highly differentiated products. This is what we see a lot in the US. This is the typical situation where there's just enough difference between the products. Shoes are an example, cars are an example, computers are an example. So it's not a perfectly competitive market. Businesses can set the price to maximize their profit, but there's still some competition.
Do you watch the show Shark Tank?
No, but I've heard of it.
That's what that reminded me of.
Okay.
Almost all the products are almost like.
So they're close enough, but they're slightly differentiated?
Well, it's each person is proposing like a product.
Okay.
And the investors, the capital investors are like, it'll work or it won't work because this is all economic.
Okay.
Feel like.
Good. So the comment was on the show Shark Tank, which is basically this type of situation, trying to have a differentiated product. Closing with high barriers to entry, firms do not face competition. Well, they face eventually maybe. So IBM got lazy in the 1980s, and eventually it faced competition from Apple, but it also faced competition from Compaq and from Hewlett-Packard, from Acer and others that made computers because it got lazy. They had no competition, and eventually it did. So this is called a monopoly. A price searcher with high barriers to entry is called a monopoly. So, oh yeah, and single seller of a well-defined good without good substitutes. Because if there are good substitutes, somebody else is going to produce it, or consumers are going to go away. So, a final quick thoughts on monopoly before we close up on this. It's possible for a monopolist to face a loss if it cannot set a price that is sufficiently high. And the other thing is monopolies typically get lazy. Unless they're protected by the government, they get lazy because they have no reason to compete. And eventually somebody comes in and is able to break the barriers to entry and compete away business from the monopoly. So a sneak preview here. Oligopoly is a situation where you have a few firms like Wendy's, Burger King, McDonald's that are controlling a large segment of the market. So they're in a monopolistic competition situation, but they also need to figure out what the other's pricing strategy is. I'm going to come back to that with a game theory when we have a full lecture on game theory in about 3 weeks. Here's a summary for you of the entire 2 lectures that I just gave, and then a final concluding comment on markets. What does the profit signal do? The profit signal is going to force companies to serve the consumer by adding value to scarce resources. If they don't add value to scarce resources, they're going to go out of business. Likewise, if a price is quote unquote too high, others are going to try to enter the market to try to compete. This is where we saw economic profits going back down to zero. Normal economic profits are going to be zero because the market's going to attract newcomers into the market unless there are high barriers to entry. So that's the concluding thought right there. Are there any questions before we close up and move on next week to some of the more strategic and value creation? Yeah.
Is that like example of Blockbuster and Netflix?
Yeah.
So they just got too comfortable and
Yeah.
they didn't see
I don't think Blockbuster got
Oh, repeat that.
lazy.
Yeah.
They just keep up.
Yeah. So the question was, did,
Well,
yeah.
you didn't innovate, so what does that mean?
Yep.
Maybe it's a form of labor.
Well, so the question was the case of Blockbuster and Netflix a question of laziness or not keeping up? You could not keep up with the technology because you're lazy.
Yeah.
You could also not keep up with the technology simply because you lack the vision. So for example, the digital camera was invented by engineers at Eastman Kodak, which for the longest time was basically a monopolist or duopolist with Fujifilm. Kodak made pretty much all the film in the US. A bunch of its engineers invent the digital film, but because they're all trained as chemical engineers, they look at this thing and they think, hey, that's a really fun project, but there's no market for it, so they put it in the basement. 15 years later, how many of you have film cameras? 1 or 2 people because you like the old school artistry. There's no market in that. Kodak declared bankruptcy. So the laziness can come in two forms. One, it can be that simply you're complacent and you're spending so much energy trying to keep people out of the market rather than trying to innovate. And the second one is, well, you don't really have to innovate. So why would you? You're not going to spend as much on research and development. So part of it is laziness, part of it could be lack of vision.
I think that's what
So I'm going to cut off the recording now, and I'll take other questions by email or the chat board.